You might say it's a weird time to be a Donkey Kong fan. Nintendo's been recycling the franchise's content recently. There was 2024's Mario vs. Donkey Kong, which I reviewed earlier this year, and the upcoming Donkey Kong Country Returns HD. Both of these games are not new strictly speaking, with the former being a remake of a 20-year-old Game Boy Advance game, which itself was a remake of a 30-year-old Game Boy game. I don't mind the iterative nature of these games though, because they added enough elements to keep it fresh and engaging. If you watched my review, I said that while it's a decent game and gave it a 7.5 out of 10, I did suggest waiting for it to go on sale. Donkey Kong Country Returns HD is a remake too, with the original coming out in 2010 and a 3DS port in 2013. It'll be priced at $60, and I don't know how to feel about this price point yet. It feels like it should be receiving the same amount of criticism, or at least skepticism, that all the Last of Us remakes and remasters got, but I guess we'll find out when it comes out in January. Of all the times Nintendo could do this, I guess it makes sense right now, considering Donkey Kong Country turned 30 this year, although I think a better move would have been a straight up remake. While overall a good game, it does have enough shortcomings that a remake would serve it and the fandom very well. It's been 3 decades since its release in November of 1994, cementing itself as part of gaming history. Numerous videos and articles have gone into detail about how Rare did amazing things to get it looking the way it did back then. As someone who was around and playing games when it first came out, I have to admit I didn't understand the gravity and awesomeness of what they managed to squeeze into such a small cartridge. I was, however, frustrated with how difficult it was. Donkey Kong Country is not an easy game, and if you're younger and thinking of trying it out, know that you're in for some of that retro difficulty you hear us old-timers talk about. With that in mind, I thought I'd look back at the original game and see how I feel about it today versus when I was a kid 30 years ago. A game should feel fun and fair, but Donkey Kong Country teeters on each of those borders. Sometimes not fun, and sometimes not fair. Every now and then, both. Other games I've played through and finished only to immediately start all over again. Breath of the Wild, The Messenger, Borderlands 2, but Donkey Kong Country requires space between playthroughs. If I had to dial in and examine why this is the case, I would say because of that feeling of it not being fair. It's like 1 out of every 4 times you fuck up, it wasn't your fault, but something feels off about it. Take that as you will though, because like I said before, I'm not very good at games, though I did play this one start to finish 3 or 4 times, so at this point I feel like I have all the really hard parts etched into my brain. My playthroughs were also varied enough that I can say it wasn't hardware. I played once on the original cartridge via my Superboy, twice on my analog Super NT, and another on NSO. To its credit, its technical achievements for both the time of release and the platform can't be overstated. There's a clear demarcation of games before and after this series. It was a very deliberate attempt to make something more than we'd seen before, to go beyond the limits of the time. The look of this game was simply unbelievable in late 1994. Video after video has been made going over just how Rare used advanced workstations to make 3D models that translated into 2D, and gave us what looked like a game from 10 years in the future at that point. You can't deny this series' rightful place in the history of gaming evolution. The game looks breathtaking, detailed, and rich, but also busy. Very busy. So much so that you might say the foreground and background blend in together too much. Games like Super Mario World or Super Mario Wonder, or any other 2D platformer have a very defined, distinct platform and ground to run around on. The levels here that have more going on feel messy, like they're not well delineated, and the levels that have less going on look far better today. Look at the water levels where it's just the leaves surrounding you and the blue ocean in the background. This really looks like someone made it yesterday. The same cannot be said for other levels. One thing that looked awful though, even back then, is the world map. I get that maps are inherently a distortion of the world, but I mean just look at this thing. The other thing that doesn't look great is any stage with rain. When it lets up and you can see the world around you better, you feel like you've been denied this beautiful scenery the last few minutes. Switching between characters is fun and appreciated. They're balanced enough that you can feel the need for one over the other at different times. Donkey Kong being a tank and Diddy having a much more fluid movement. However, I wish instead of the ground pound, Donkey Kong had some sort of punch move. He's a giant gorilla for crying out loud. I wish he had more of an attack than just slamming his hands or jumping. He should be able to outright punch opponents, but I guess they didn't want him to be too OP and lose that balance I mentioned earlier. I do appreciate the enemy variety, though many are just palette swaps in later stages. While most of them don't feel cheap, I'd swear that some of them are just there to troll you. The rock crocs in Stop and Go Station, I'd swear they're placed mathematically perfectly for maximum irritation, especially on the floating platforms. Maybe this is where my feelings of unfairness come from. And finally, my biggest gripe with this game, the field of view. I absolutely hate how hard it is to see anything beyond a few feet. It feels crowded compared to today's games, and yes, this was designed for older 4x3 screens, but you are constantly hit or killed by items just off the screen. Items especially feel like they're hidden in a cheap way too, with them being literally not visible. It feels like they didn't use the limitations of the hardware to their advantage, but rather took advantage of the player's inability to know certain things. Yes, this is a thing games do, but here it's almost constant and it gets old. Discovery and exploration shouldn't cost lives, so obviously I'm not going to do leaps of faith constantly to find every coin or collectible or barrel, yet that's what's needed here. Once or twice in a game, fine. Continuously throughout the whole game, no thank you. Oh, and the minecarts. Minecart carnage? F this level. Don't get me wrong, I'm really fucking good at this level now. Like I'd bet money I could beat it in less than 3 tries, and honestly that's saying something, because not a single person off the street could beat this in less than 10 tries. Now, in their defense, I must have played it 1,000 times at this point. I had to put the game down for a few days when writing this episode, and when I picked it back up, I beat it using 2 lives. I then went back and played it again. Why? Well, I find myself hate playing it at this point. All this to say, it's a sufficiently challenging level, but does have its cheap shots, especially the last fucking card at the very end, after the arrow sign. Go f*** yourself, crocodile, in a fucking minecart. Look, we can't deny that seeing Donkey Kong go from a barrel-wielding antagonist in 8-bit to the nearly 3D protagonist of the Donkey Kong Country series was earth-shattering. Remember that this was playing on the same hardware that we got Super Mario World and Pilot Wings released on. Donkey Kong Country will forever be an example of what can be done on hardware regardless of how withered it might be. So yes, it is a difficult game, one that I struggled to get through mentally, and I think it's a little bit unfair, but hey, my gripes are my own. Do I like this game? Yes. Does it still make me angry? Absolutely. If you're younger, play this game and come back and tell me if you thought it was as hard or as unfair as I feel it is. If you aren't into platformers, maybe don't try it as your first experience in the genre. What am I saying? Why am I shitting on one of the greatest games ever made? Well, man, it's my playthrough, so I can feel what I want about it. I guess what I'm getting at is that if they do end up doing something with this game in the coming year or in the near future, they need to look long and hard at the more recent iterations of the series and make something more akin to Tropical Freeze. That game is extremely hard, demands a lot of precision, and is unforgiving, except in funky mode, but is honest, is not cheap, and doesn't pull any tricks. I hope the forthcoming games in the series do as much for the IP as Donkey Kong Country did for it back in the 90s. Rare made something impressive, challenging, and enduring. Not an easy task. Thanks for watching. If you're not subscribed, now would be a great time to push that button and leave a like. We'll see you next time.